The story of Charlie Horsky is of a modest man of extraordinary accomplishment. Today we attempt an essentially impossible task of capturing in a few minutes the full scope of Charlie's enormous contributions to our society, and also of enjoying at least a glimpse of Charlie the warm-hearted man. Charlie's heyday preceded the age of electronic recording, so there is no video material that includes him. Fortunately, however, we have the benefit of an oral history of Charlie, supplemented by an extensive interview done by the D.C. Bars magazine. So we are able to recall much of Charlie's career and life through his own words. Judge Jim Belson, a great friend and admirer of Charlie, has generously agreed to read Charlie's comments and thereby help us to appreciate the man and how he came to lead such an illustrious career. It is appropriate at this gathering, primarily of lawyers, at the nation's highest court, to begin with Charlie the advocate. For Charlie's later vast public service and civic service life has perhaps obscured the fact that he was one of the leading appellate advocates of his time, with more than a dozen significant cases argued in the Supreme Court. His most famous case was undoubtedly Korematsu versus United States, which challenged the legality of the internment of Japanese American citizens resident in California at the outset of World War II. Here is what Charlie remembered of the case a half-century after it was argued.
Korematsu was a young, intelligent Japanese-American citizen who refused on grounds of principle to report for internment. He was arrested, and because he refused to report for internment, he was convicted, and he wound up in one of the internment camps. The United States tried to avoid calling it a concentration camp, but it was damn near that. Anyway, he appealed and finally got it to the Supreme Court. I had, I think, 20 minutes to argue, and I think it was the best argument I ever made. I did not prevail, but I really put my heart into that one, and I thought we were dead right. We were dead right, as it finally turned out. 40 years later, Mr. Korematsu brought an action to review his conviction. A district court in California made elaborate findings after a full trial and found that the United States had misled the Supreme Court. It set aside the conviction, and the government did not appeal. So I feel a little bit vindicated about what I truly thought was a terrible decision.
It is not surprising that Charlie Horsky became one of our leading Supreme Court advocates. He studied law at Harvard, where he was president of the Law Review. That was followed by a clerkship with Augustus Hand on the Second Circuit, one of the most sought-after of all judicial clerkships, and then 2 stints in the office of the Solicitor General, one immediately following the clerkship, and a second after he had been at Covington and Burling for about a year. Charlie's Supreme Court record reflects a broad range of subjects: labor board enforcement, price controls, immigration and citizenship law, railroad cases, the leading Bill of Attainder case, and the seminal case on defendants' right to effective appeals of their convictions. Charlie's last Supreme Court argument, capping over 40 years of advocacy before the court, was the Vermont Yankee Nuclear Power Company case, where the court agreed with Charlie that the lower court had erred in overturning an agency approval of a reactor license over the objections of an environmental group that there had been insufficient attention to the environmental impact.
Apparently, the Supreme Court's ruling was somewhat of a surprise to the administrative law crowd. One of my classmates in law school, Ken Davis, who wrote the treatise on administrative law, called me up after the decision and said, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself for persuading the court to do what you just did. That is so inconsistent with basic principles of administrative law, and it's really outrageous. You ought to apologize to the bar." And I said, Well, after all, when you have a client, you want to win. I won.
In 1945, Charlie Horsky took another leave from Covington and Burling to join the American team preparing for the Nuremberg war crimes trials. His initial work was Pentagon-based. He assisted in securing evidence for the trials and in arranging for the first ever multiple language simultaneous translation system that was used in the trials. Subsequently, he went to Nuremberg and participated in the second round of trials of Nazi collaborators. Charlie specifically recalled how his simultaneous translation system worked at the trial he participated in.
The interpreters were really superb. They did a marvelous job. I had occasion to experience their skill. I was examining a German witness and was waging a pretty vigorous examination. I had my earphones so I could understand his answers in German, and he had his to understand my questions in English. One time I looked up at the interpreter, and he was reading a comic book. Interpretation was automatic so far as he was concerned. He didn't even have to think.
Charlie took yet another leave from Covington and Burling in 1962 to become the first advisor to the president on national capital affairs. Philip Graham, publisher of the Washington Post, had persuaded President Kennedy that he needed to pay attention to the district, and he recommended Charlie as the person who could help. Phil told Charlie of his recommendation.
I talked to Dean Acheson, and he said, "Don't do it. All those Irish fellows over there would never work with you." But I thought this was just too good a chance to pass up, and I told Phil I would do it. Phil told me to call Bobby Kennedy and get it worked out. I went to see him and had a good conversation. At the outset, I said that there was one thing I think I'd better tell you. I'm probably on the FBI's undesirable list. Bobby said, "Well, I've known something about that, and I've got your file over here from the FBI. And I looked it over, and I think it's fine. I'm all for you." So I took the job and went to the White House.
Charlie's first meeting with President Kennedy set the stage for his extremely productive tenure as presidential advisor.
He said, "I've been in this town for quite a long time, and in the White House for a year, and I don't know a damn thing about the district, really, except that it exists. What I really need is somebody who will tell me what to do. I want you to do what you think ought to be done, in my name, and whatever you do, I will back you up. Just keep me posted as to what you are doing, but don't come back and ask me what to do. That's what you're supposed to figure out."
The list of projects that Charlie either implemented while in the White House or at least started on the path to completion attests to his effectiveness. It includes the Pennsylvania Avenue redevelopment, including the restoration of the old post office building, the D.C. Home Rule Act, the Union Station redevelopment, the creation of the first district four-year college, establishment of the Woodrow Wilson Center as part of the Smithsonian Institution, the creation of the Kennedy Center, and the establishment of the Metro subway system. The latter was a particularly fine example of Charlie's skill in navigating the treacherous shoals of intergovernmental relations.
One of the hurdles was to get an agreement between the district, Maryland, Virginia, and the Congress on an interstate compact which would govern the operations of the subway. If you think it is difficult to get an agreement between two states on something, it is astronomically more difficult to get an agreement between three jurisdictions and then to get Congress to approve it as well. With a lot of maneuvering and a lot of negotiations back and forth, they finally arrived at a compact.
One of Charlie's White House colleagues was Harry McPherson, then serving as counsel to the president.
Charlie Horsky was Mr. District of Columbia in the administrations of Lyndon Johnson, as he had been for John Kennedy. Charlie was a man of such character and quality that Johnson was delighted to have him as his advisor. Things having to do with the District of Columbia would not have taken place in the Johnson administration without Charlie Horsky's okay.
I originally planned to stay a year, maybe 2 years, but I just couldn't get permission from the presidents to leave. Kennedy wouldn't let me go, and when LBJ came in, I submitted my resignation along with everybody else, as was customary. He called me and said, "I don't want you to leave. I need you." I said, "I've been here quite a long time." He said, "Stay a little longer. It won't hurt."
One of Charlie's signal accomplishments at the White House was to initiate the process, later embodied in legislation, that led to the establishment of the district's first four-year college.
When I left the White House in 1967, much to my surprise, I was notified by President Johnson that I was appointed to the Board of Higher Education, which was tasked by the legislation with bringing the college into existence. We had a meeting, and I got appointed to be chairman.
And the upshot of that was the establishment of the Federal City College and the Washington Technical Institute, later to become the main components of the University of the District of Columbia. Charlie's own summary of his White House experience reflects his modesty and lack of self-promotion.
I didn't feel let down, particularly coming out of the White House. I had enjoyed it very much. It was a fun job. It was an interesting job. It seemed to me a worthwhile job. And I flatter myself to think I left the district in a little better condition than when I took the job. In any event, I tried.
It has been said that Charlie Horsky never met a civic organization he would not nurture and support. His own explanation for his extensive involvements was more prosaic. He said, "I have a terrible time saying no." Charlie helped establish or supported a plethora of civic organizations in the District of Columbia, including the ACLU, the National Building Museum, the Federal City Council, the D.C. Jail Visitor Services Center, the Council for Court Excellence, about which more later, and the Eugene and Agnes E. Meyer Foundation. Charlie's work with civic organizations began in earnest in 1955. His description of his initial foray well reflects Charlie's outlook on life.
One day I was reading a newspaper and discovered that the Community Chest, as it was called, had refused to fund the Washington Housing Association on the ground that public housing was too controversial. The association was founded by Eleanor Roosevelt basically to get rid of alley dwellings in the district, and later to promote public housing. I thought the Community Chest refusal to fund the WHA was pretty short-sighted. I decided I would remedy that as far as I could by sending a contribution to the association. It wasn't very big, something like $250, but it turned out to be one of the largest contributions the association got. So I was promptly elected a member of the board of directors, and shortly after that was elected president. In that position, I began to learn something about the district and became acquainted with the people in the district building. I stayed as chairman until I went to the White House in 1962.
In fact, when Charlie accepted the White House offer, he had to resign from numerous civic offices to which he was devoting his time and energy. For over a decade, Charlie served in a leadership role in the Meyer Foundation, perhaps the most influential and generous private foundation in the area. Julie Rogers is the longtime executive director of the foundation.
Charlie Horsky was an incredibly modest man who in many ways was more comfortable in the Montana wilderness than he was in the halls of power in Washington. From that very moment when he got intrigued with the work of the Washington Housing Association and the lives of public housing residents, he was totally hooked. He was fiercely committed to justice for all DC residents and especially for those residents who live with very little money in the city. So over the years, he took an incredible number of roles that he never took any credit for. He chaired boards, he helped to found the Visitor Service Center to work with prisoners. I remember going to the jail with him and Ann Cunningham Keep to visit prisoners as they figured out how they would come back into the community. He got $50,000 from Jack Kennedy to figure out how the District of Columbia should begin to serve students who wanted to go on to higher education. He worked, obviously, countless hours with the Council on the Administration of Justice. He worked with kids for child welfare issues. And I think that in many ways, he was astonishing because he took no credit. That little twinkle in his eye was always there, but it was never about Charlie Horsky. He was just a man deeply committed to poor people who lived here and able to do a lot through his time, his intellect, his connections throughout the city. He made a huge difference in many lives, and I'm really grateful that I was able to be his friend.
During the years of his greatest activity on behalf of civic organizations, Charlie Horsky also maintained a vigorous and varied law practice, culminating in what was undoubtedly the largest and most complex legal assignment in his career, overseeing the reorganization of the railroad system in the eastern United States and the conversion of the Penn Central and several other bankrupt railroads into Conrail and Amtrak. That included a landmark Supreme Court victory on behalf of the Penn Central. Despite devoting so much time and energy to public service and civic causes, as well as managing a major law practice, Charlie's service to the legal profession equaled in scope and importance his other contributions to the community and to the nation. Consider, Charlie served as chairman of the National Bankruptcy Conference in 2 separate tenures for over 16 years. He served on the board of the D.C. Bar for 6 years, as a member of the ABA House of Delegates for 4, and as a member for 7 years on the ABA committee that vetted nominees for federal judicial positions. In 1980, he was selected as the district's Lawyer of the Year. In addition to all this, Charlie taught a seminar on civil rights law at the University of Virginia Law School for many years, and he became a faculty member of the prestigious Salzburg Seminar, devoting time in several summers to that endeavor. Charlie lectured at other law schools on occasion. One set of lectures early on became a book called The Washington Lawyer, which for many years was required reading for first-year law students at leading law schools. Charlie explained the book this way 4 decades later.
I describe the Washington Lawyer in 3 ways. 1, influencing legislation. 2, intervening with the executive branch. 3, appearing before the federal judiciary. That's still basically what it's all about, except there's a lot more than doing it now, which gives it an aura of respectability that it probably didn't have before.
At a time in life when many lawyers have exchanged work for relaxation, Charlie undertook a major assignment for the D.C. Bar, what turned out to be a 4-year study of the D.C. courts, culminating in what is known as the Horsky Report, which led to a wide range of improvements in the operation of the local courts. Charlie was characteristically understated about his qualifications to take on that effort when asked to do so by the Board of Governors of the Bar. I was asked to chair a study of the courts. I said I was the worst person in the world. I don't know anything about the D.C. courts. I never appeared in the D.C. courts. No, I take that back. I moved an admission in the D.C. Court of Appeals once, and I won. But they said, that's exactly what we want, somebody without any prejudice. Charlie agreed to take on the assignment. Sam Harahan was hired to head the study committee staff. One outgrowth of the Horsky Report was the establishment of the Council for Court Excellence, an organization of judges, lawyers, and citizens committed to improving the court system. Sam Harahan became the first executive director and held the position for over 20 years.
The Council for Court Excellence really came about for three reasons. First, the bar had completed this major study that Mr. Horsky and I and many others were involved in, which came to be called the Horsky Report, but the recommendations were not self-executing. And so one of the reasons why the Council for Court Excellence came into being was that we needed a vehicle in order to implement the recommendations coming out of the Horsky Committee. The second reason why I think it gravitated to being formed was that the Unified Bar and other groups were not really kind of present enough to provide sustained support to the court system. Finally, we came across a group in New York City called the Fund for Modern Courts when we were doing research for the Horsky Committee report, and it had active business and civic and legal leadership in that entity. And that became the organization that we initially modeled the council after.
Rufus King, former Chief Judge of the Superior Court, describes the benefit of the court's implementation of the committee's recommendations.
Over the years, as the report was issued, the recommendations became increasingly adopted, but it has made a huge difference in the operation of the court and the court's outstanding position among state courts in as a unusually strong and well-functioning urban trial court.
Everyone who ever worked with Charlie Horsky loved the experience and the man.
Charlie was a prince of a fellow. He was a pleasure to work with. Charlie always took the high road. Charlie was the kind of person that would always back you up and always be supportive of what you're doing, but at the same time was very willing to do what needed to be done. Another attribute that I can think of with Charlie is that Charlie had no ego. One of our board members once described Charlie in a football term that Charlie's the only guy he's ever met that when he comes out on the football field he's not wearing a number. In Washington, with all this high-priced type A talent, everybody wants to be quarterback. Mr. Horsky would play any role that a situation demanded, and that really made it a joy to work with him.
We've learned something of Charlie Horsky, the advocate, the civic and bar leader, the public servant. What of Charlie the person, the partner, the father, the Mountain West native? Jim McKay was Charlie Horsky's partner at Covington and Burling for 40 years and has himself been a leading figure in the D.C. bar for over a half-century.
When I first met Charlie Horsky in 1945, I'd been hired as a law clerk at Covington and Burling while attending night school at Georgetown University Law School. Charlie greeted me as though I was Mr. Burling Sr. I never knew a more generous or friendly person than Charlie Horsky. Everybody from the top to the bottom loved him and admired him. I was a direct beneficiary of his generosity. When my wife and I had purchased a house, had contracted to buy a house, and at the same time we had to sell the house in which we were living in order to be able to close the deal. Well, unfortunately, we were $5,000 short. We couldn't sell the house in which we were living. Well, I thought, I'll see if Mr. Burling Jr. would sign a note on behalf of the firm so that I could borrow the money from the bank, and he said he would do that. Well, I'd no sooner gotten back into my office after speaking with Mr. Burley Jr. than in walks Charlie Horsky. And he looks at me and says, "I hear you need some money." Well, I said, "Yeah, I do need some money." He said, "Well, how much?" I said, "Well, $5,000. He sat down, took out his checkbook, wrote a check for $5,000, handed it to me and said, "I don't care when you pay this back, and I don't want any interest." Well, it was just tons and tons of worry just suddenly disappeared in my life, in my wife's life. It's difficult to sum things up with respect to Charlie Horsky, but I would sum it up by saying that Charlie, born and bred in his beloved Montana, was the salt of the earth.
Margaret Ellen Horsky Nunez, Charlie's daughter, remembers her father with the greatest affection and admiration.
I first met Horsky in February 1945 when he and his wife and my mother, Barbara, chose me to be their daughter. I was a very, very fortunate child. When I was 8, I was introduced to riding horses, and throughout my years to my 20s, Dad gave up every weekend to run me around to horse shows. Dad used to go to Montana every year, and it was his salvation. He would work very hard for Covington and all his various things that he had his hands into. And he would come to a place called Lincoln, Montana. Dad just relaxed. He drove my grandpa, Judge Anton Horsky, and his wife Millie lived also in the same property as my dad. And my Aunt Flora and Uncle Sherman, they would come up too, and their boys, John and Tony. And Dad's favorite thing to do out there was go fly fishing. And he also rode horses out there. And I did too. And Dad would take me to the rodeos. He'd take me into Helena, and we'd go to the rodeos. And then Dad got interested in horses. And we had a horse here that I never rode, but his name was Spanish Sea. He was a point-to-point racehorse. And Ethel Kennedy used to ride him at the Washington Horse Show, which Dad was president of for many years. And there's a lot of things that Dad did, but he never realized how proud I was to be his daughter and how fortunate and what a good life he gave me.
Charlie Horsky's annual return to Montana, the place of his birth, renewed his spirit and undoubtedly contributed to his serene disposition. Judge Jim Belson was a frequent companion on those treks to the Mountain West.
I've come to realize that I didn't really know Charlie Horsky as a person until I spent some time with him in 1990 in Montana, his native state. His father had built a cabin there in the early 1900s. Charlie later built a cottage on the same parcel of land. It was a simple cottage, unpretentious, but comfortable. Charlie was also very comfortable up in the mountains, which he loved. And every year he hired an outfitting company owned by the Hefner family called the K. Lazy 3 Ranch Outfitters. And Charlie would ride with them and his group up into the mountains for 10 days or 2 weeks every summer. The members of the Hefner family who heard that I was taking part in this video, without my even asking for it, sent me some of their memories of Charlie. And I'd like to read those and speak it the way they said it. Jeff Hefner, who was maybe in his late 20s at that time, was the son of the person who started the company, his father Ken Hefner. Mary Faith Hefner, his mother, was then, say, in her late 50s, and they were along on that trip. Here's what Jeff had to say about Charlie. I remember him playing cribbage with Dad. He'd go fly fishing. He'd like to go down to the creek and catch a fish. It didn't have to be a big one, just catch a fish. He was happy. He felt at peace in the mountains. He was just part of the landscape and part of the mountains. He was relaxed and at home. I've never seen a person who loved nature as much as Charlie. He'd just sit back, smoke his pipe, and observe. He just loved being there. He didn't have to do anything fancy, anything exciting, and he never, ever complained about anything, the food, the horseback ride, the pain. He didn't pack much. An old sleeping bag, an old jacket, and a couple of changes of clothes, nothing fancy, and never talked about what he did. He never talked about Washington. And Mary Faith Hefner said this, Charlie liked the simple things in life. In camp, he enjoyed the birds and the chipmunks and the squirrels. He'd spread peanut butter on a piece of paper, take a string and hang it on a branch, and he'd watch as the camp robbers, the Canadian jays, ate the treat. One thing he loved most back at camp was the bonfire. And as soon as we got back to camp, everyone would gather sticks for the fire. He and Barbara would sing all Montana songs. He was a fabulous singer, and so was Barbara, great singers. He'd always sit back and smoke his pipe and enjoy his surroundings. The last years he rode into the backcountry, we'd have to lift him onto his horse and lift him off his horse. He wasn't too proud. He just wanted to be back in the scapegoat. He always told me if he died back there, it would be fine. He wouldn't mind.
How to sum up? When Charlie died, the Washington Post published an appreciative editorial that began, in so many ways that few people may realize, what is good about Washington, hometown and world capital, can be linked to Charles A. Horsky. John Pickering, himself a giant in the D.C. bar and a great supporter of civic causes, reflecting on his own long career, remarked, Charlie Horsky was my personal hero. The proudest thing I ever said about my work was, I'm helping Horsky. Frank Sinatra once introduced a film clip of Fred Astaire, admonishing us to watch it carefully because you won't see the likes of this again. Charlie Horsky was a beautiful human being who gave everything he could to his family, his community, and his nation. He was always a force for good. We are not likely to see the likes of him for a very long time.
To honor Charlie's remarkable career, Covington and Burling established and endowed the Charles A. Horsky Scholarships at the University of the District of Columbia to support the education each year of deserving graduates of District of Columbia high schools who choose to enroll as full-time students in UDC. To date, the scholarships have assisted over 25 students to complete a 4-year course of study at UDC.